could cry. Behind it, Lord, the fear of fellow man is a mere assignment, and everything that we're denied by keeping the divide, it's not the waking, it's the rising. And I could cry.
Stronger than me, straight into the face that tells you to rattle your chains.
Greetings, everybody. Welcome back. My name is Deandra Rose. I'm the Director of Research for Polis, the Center for Politics here at Duke University's Sanford School of Public Policy. And I am excited to welcome you to this panel of our two-day virtual symposium, The Vote, Reimagining What It Could Be. So we have had, since yesterday, a number of compelling panels and discussions where we've thought really aspirationally about what the vote could look like and what democratic citizenship could look like. And so we started our conference with some insights from research, and I'm excited to end with this panel before we turn to our keynote address this evening at 6 p.m. During this panel, we'll have the opportunity to close the loop with some research. So I am excited to showcase and to present two emerging scholars who are doing cutting edge work in the democracy space. We have with us Adam Staniland and Ruth Weigel. And I will ask Ruth and Adam to share their videos as I read their bios if they would. First off, we have Adam Staniland, who is a joint degree doctoral candidate in psychology and public policy here at Duke University. His research explores the social and motivational factors that contribute to boys' and men's gender identity development. Right now, Adam is studying how masculinity stereotypes negatively affect the development of men and boys, their behavior, for example, aggression, and their decision-making process, for example, political participation. We're also excited to have with us Ruth Weigel. Ruth is a third-year PhD student in the Department of Sociology at Duke University. She's also affiliated with the International Max Planck Research School for Population Health and Data Science. Ruth's research interests are situated in two broad topic areas: the aging of the justice-involved population in the US, and the role of administrative decision-making in perpetuating and alleviating the burden of mass incarceration. Ruth is especially interested in the operation and utilization of jails, and currently she's involved in work examining the practice of jail leasing, as well as work exploring the feasibility and utility of state-minded standardized jail data collection. Additionally, she's previously been involved with efforts to register voters in the Durham County Detention Facility. So welcome to you, Ruth. Welcome to you, Adam. Thanks so much for being with us today. So we will turn to Adam first. So each of our panelists will share some short talks that present the research that they're working on. So Adam, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Rose. So thank you. Welcome everyone to our talks. I hope that we provide some valuable social science insights into the voting process, or I like to say, very small parts of the voting process. So in particular, I'll be talking about, let me go ahead and start sharing my screen. Getting used to this Zoom interface. So today I'm going to be talking about some of my research as it relates to men's political decision making, and I call this part of my research fragile masculinity, and I'll get into exactly what that means during my talk. I know that term is kind of thrown around in the political sphere and in some kind of psychology spheres, but nobody's ever really tried to define it yet. So a lot of my research goes out and tries to define it, and I conceptualize kind of some of the consequences of fragile masculinity as having to do with men's political decision making. So I welcome you to this talk, and this featured image that I have presented today was just too perfect of timing. It was a tweet by Tomi Lahren, who's the Fox News correspondent, or used to be at some point, and still a very conservative pundit. And she tweeted in response to Joe Biden's saying that people should wear a mask, or saying that that's part of his political position, saying that he might as well carry a purse with that mask. And I think that was too perfect of a tweet not to share as it relates to kind of fragile masculinity and the notions of some of the political moves that men especially are making as it relates to their masculinity and the current political space that we're living in. So to start out with some key demographics to kind of identify why this is an important area of research to look at, I first want to present some different stats about gender and race and some kind of upbringing statistics that have to do with kind of the research, the people that I research, these men specifically. So if we look first at the men versus women breakdown of who supports Trump versus Biden, we can see that there's kind of a small discrepancy when it comes to men. More men tend to support Trump than they do Biden. But when you look at the female discrepancy, it's a good kind of counterfactual to the male breakdown, and that 57% of women support Biden and 36% of women support Trump. So you can see that kind of should make you wonder, why is there this discrepancy there? Is there something about Trump that's inherently more masculine? And the answer is yes. There's something, research has shown that people tend to associate Trump, especially compared to his Democratic counterparts, whether it's Hillary or Biden or Kamala or any of them, as more stereotypically masculine. So that's going to be kind of the basis of the theoretical foundation I'm going to lay. And then looking at the breakdown of Trump kind of versus Clinton supporters, as we think about who supported those candidates in the 2016 election, first looking at community type. So you can see that many more rural and suburban voters voted for Trump versus voted for Clinton. So that's kind of, we're looking at now maybe rural men is kind of the demographic that we're moving into, rural and suburban. Also looking at the racial breakdown. So this kind of leaning towards white men compared to men of other races. So white rural men. And then looking at this breakdown of race and education, I kind of just skipped over education because it's summed up pretty well in the race and education graphic. And so now we're looking at these non-college educated, rural, suburban, white men specifically, who seem to dramatically or significantly be more likely to endorse Trump. And so then that begs the question of kind of, why do these men support Trump? Is it something about their socialization from an identity perspective? Is it something about their upbringing? So today I'm going to talk to you very briefly about kind of one theory that we're developing that might explain why a small portion of these these rural, non-college educated white men support Trump as his main voter base there. So again, this was kind of just to hone in, and you can see these pictures all throughout Trump's rallies, and that the majority of his supporters are really this base. You'll see a lot of other, especially white women, in pictures of his rallies. My research does not really explain or try to explain necessarily white women's support for Trump as it compares to black women's, maybe your other kind of counterfactuals you may think of there. But I'm really interested in why these non-college educated rural white men tend to be the majority of Trump's voter base. So then that begs the question that I'm trying to answer with this research of what explains Trump's appeal to certain white men. So again, we're talking about kind of these specific subsections and not trying to explain all support for Trump in any way. And I also want to answer this kind of more specific question is, can these men's aggressive political decision-making stances be explained by their own adverse experiences with restrictive masculine norms? So that's a longer question. I'm going to break that down as we go throughout the talk. I will talk more about what I mean by aggressive political decision-making. It could be voting for Trump, supporting war, not wearing a mask, things that might be conceptualized as harming other people. And I'm going to get into as well what I mean by adverse experiences with masculine norms as we go through right now. So to kind of zoom out a little and talk about social identity first, because psychology is my background, people have various identities that they think about the groups that they belong to, and they derive a lot of their self-worth from those identities. So it could be our gender, it could be our religion, our race, or even the status that we feel like we fall in society. So those groups really determine how we feel about ourselves, how we behave in line with those various groups. And so there's norms related to each of these groups that really boil down into expectations for how we should behave in line with those groups. So I call these frames of reference or guidelines and for how people should interact with their social worlds. And then they're specific to those social norms are gender norms. So we have norms for how boys versus girls versus men versus women should act. And those kind of may be, depending on your culture or the culture in which you live, those could be very rigid and restrictive. They could be very loose and flexible. So in some societies and cultures, there may not be much delineation in terms of how men versus women should behave. In other cultures, there's a lot more delineation. So again, there's this cultural variation in how rigid versus flexible these socio-cultural norms are. And so I'm going to say in this talk that there are certain socio-cultural contexts with rigid norms, including especially rigid masculine norms. So these are called cultures of honor, for instance, or different rural areas of the US South or the broader US might have these more really restrictive masculine notions that say boys and men can only be tough and aggressive and sexual, that contribute to a lot of pressure that certain boys and men experience. So again, in certain cultures, men are expected to constantly prove this masculinity that they're feeling pressured to do. So that may be, you hear the slogan like, boys don't cry, grow up, boys shouldn't act like girls, these anti-gay ideals as well. They put a lot of pressure on certain boys, and so I'm gonna incorporate that idea into men's political behavior. And so one thing I wanna point out before going on is that this asserting of one's masculinity is often accomplished via aggression and violence. So that's a quick way. This is research on culture of honor specifically, but that's a quick and easy way for men to prove that they are masculine, is to assert that aggression in kind of this public space. So if my masculinity is being threatened, to easily try to reassert that, I could, punch someone or talk aggressively to someone to kind of prove that, I am a man. So what are you talking about, kind of thing. So this is a big area of research in psychology called precarious manhood that says that manhood must be earned and constantly proven in these cultures where these rigid norms are, and it can be easily lost. And so when it's easily lost, men do become aggressive as a way to try to defend it. And so my research looks at who specifically are these men? Who are the men? Because we know that not all men, even in these restrictive contexts, become aggressive in response to threats. So who specifically are these men? So in order to belong, so basic human need to belong, these men must contradict their own. So there's a subset of men that were arguing are masculine out of a need to belong to other people, to feel this relatedness, as you can see on the right side. But at the same time, that goes against their intrinsic motivations or who they are as people. So these norms are oftentimes so rigid that not all men or many men can't live up to them. But on a day-to-day basis, when you're having to constantly prove your masculinity, that's contradicting. You're trying to belong, you're trying to fit in with your friends and your family and satisfy that basic human need, but it's contradicting maybe who you are as a person innately. And so what we're arguing is that is the kind of adverse gender experience, masculine experience, that a lot of a certain set or a good amount of boys and men may undergo in these really restrictive contexts. So again, it leads to this pressure that we think may lead to aggression. And so here's some actual real psychological data from a paper that we have coming out this year that looked at men's aggressive cognition, so how aggressive men were thinking as a function of whether we gave them threatening feedback or not, and how much pressure they felt. So this dark gray line you can see is the threat condition. So these are men who received feedback that said they were masculine. So all we did was have them take this bogus test and gave them feedback saying they were masculine or not. These are men who received feedback that saying that they were not masculine. These are men who received feedback saying that they were masculine. And on the x-axis is how much pressure they felt. So as you can see, the more pressure men felt when they were feeling the need to reassert their manhood, the more aggressive they were thinking in response to those threats. So again, the more pressure they felt to be masculine, the more aggressive they were to try to reaffirm their manhood. And we call this fragile masculinity. And we have a big theory paper coming out early next year, hopefully, that kind of goes through the developmental processes that contribute to this fragile masculinity state. But what I wanted to talk to you or present to you here are some ideas about how else this aggression might be given off by these men. So in addition to being maybe physically aggressive to try to reassert manhood, we're going to argue that they have different political aggressive means, these men who feel all this fragile masculinity, to reassert their manhood when they need to or when they feel like it's being challenged. So for instance, that might be voting for Trump, because research that just came out this year by a collaborator of mine, Sarah DiMuccio at NYU, showed that men and women do associate Trump as being masculine and politically aggressive. So that might be one thing that these men are seeking out when they need to prove their masculinity. Anti-masking, again, is seen as an infringement on one's autonomy. And so to not wear a mask would be to assert oneself as independent and masculine. Not supporting Black Lives Matter. So we see Black Lives Matter conceptualized as something that may threaten white men's manhood specifically. Again, anti-LGBT equality. There have been some recent Supreme Court talk of whether we should roll back the clock on LGBTQ equality and abortion. And so those are both things that we think might have to do with stances that men might take if they're feeling insecure about their own masculinity. So to test this, if I had more time, I would share with you the fun way that we test this. But in brief, we're going to collect data online, since it is COVID time, of US born men and measure their demographic and gender identity variables. So trying to get at that pressure that they experience to be like the typical man or be like the average man, that fragile masculinity proxy. Then we're going to either threaten these men or not, just in a digital interface. We're going to give them feedback again to that test that says they're either really masculine or not masculine, which tends to be works surprisingly well. And then we're going to measure their political aggression as we conceptualized it over to the left here roughly. So it'll be kind of a political inventory, and it'll have subscales embedded within it that we're developing to try to get at, do men support these various political aggressive stances as a function of being threatened, so they have to reassert their manhood, and how much pressure they feel. So this fragile masculinity that we're theorizing has to contribute to it. So again, to our original question, can some white men's aggressive political decision-making, like voting for Trump, be explained by their own adverse experiences with restrictive masculine norms? If we rephrase that to shorten it, so can these aggressive political decision-making be explained by men's own fragile masculinity that they experience? And so I do want to say that we do hypothesize that yes, it does, but down the road, I try to end these talks on like an optimistic note, is that parents and teachers and the media, and especially social media, all play a huge role in contributing to the kinds of norms that may cause this fragile masculinity in the first place. And so I do want to end by saying that I believe that challenging these masculine norms, whether it's in the classroom or in a parenting context or with media or with social media, might mitigate fragile masculinity and the subsequent political aggression that we see kind of always attributed or geared toward especially marginalized groups. And so the hope there is, the other line of my research looks at how, when these kind of pressures start in adolescence, and how to reduce them before they get to the point where men would be need to reassert their fragile masculinity in these more aggressive ways. So to conclude, I just wanted to revisit this tweet and kind of suggest that it would help a lot, or go a lot way in my pre-study opinion, to kind of just get rid of that top sentiment that masks are either feminine or not feminine, and just focus on the safety of everyone and wearing masks, rather than gendering these things in politics, to try to avoid this political aggression in the future. So thank you so much, everyone, for listening.
Thank you so much, Adam. That's fantastic. And now I'm excited to turn it over to Ruth. Ruth, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. I am also going to share my screen. Okay, excellent. People can see my slides?
Yep, we can see you, Ruth. You look great.
Excellent. Okay, great. So hi, everyone. I want to start by thanking the organizers for including me in this event, and also my incredible collaborator, Allison Stolte. She has been an instrumental part of this thought process, brought this idea to me, and we got to kind of merge our research interests, and I am so grateful to have her as a thought partner in some of this work. So today I am going to be very imaginative and very hopeful, which is not always possible with the research that I do. So I want to thank you all for giving me that opportunity to really envision what a world could be, and specifically reimagining complete reenfranchisement in North Carolina. And so I want to start with some caveats. I know that I'm discussing a pretty radical idea, so I want to be very upfront with some pretty clear limitations or some popular pushback on this notion of reenfranchisement. Then we're going to look at some data from the North Carolina elections in 2016. And I've got some cool maps that I hope will kind of show us voter replacement and voter displacement, especially important given that it's a census year. And then lastly, I have a very optimistic future work slide. So to begin, based on the most recent comprehensive poll data about this topic, we know that a majority of Americans are not in favor of reenfranchising the vote for individuals currently incarcerated. So about 70% of registered or polled adults don't believe that people who are incarcerated for a felony should have the right to vote. I want to push back on this a little bit and just emphasize that this poll was done very shortly after a town hall by Bernie Sanders during the primaries last year in April, in which he basically said on stage in response to a question about giving the vote back to the Boston Marathon bomber, giving the vote back to individuals convicted of crimes on the sexual violence, that he was in favor of reenfranchisement, complete reenfranchisement. So I think there might have been a little bit of priming, but priming aside, we don't want to shy away from the idea that reenfranchisement is not currently on the American political or social agenda, but maybe one day it will be. And so in addition to public opinion, I also want to be really upfront with what we do currently know about the voting behaviors of justice-involved individuals. And so first, we do have some evidence to suggest that even when given the opportunity to vote while incarcerated in a state prison, individuals choose not to participate in democratic elections. So Vermont and Maine are currently the only two states in the United States where you can vote while you are incarcerated in a state prison. And White and Ugayan did some research using data from Vermont, and they found that in the 2016 election, fewer than 10% of eligible voters incarcerated in the prisons opted to participate. And what White and Nagayan actually encourage us to do is move away from our focus on how could justice-involved voting influence our elections, which I totally admit is a major point of the things I'm about to discuss. And they actually encourage us to really shift the conversation to more moral conversations. Do we want to live in a country where being convicted of a felony also involves being stripped of this precious civil liberty? And the second point I want to raise is to kind of push back and maybe challenge some expectations of how we think justice-involved individuals might vote and what their political beliefs might be. And so this really cool recent survey by the Marshall Project in combination with Slate, the journalistic outlet, they collected mail-in surveys from incarcerated individuals. They had a sample of over 8,000 people who answered questions on a variety of topics and included a pretty large section on political beliefs. And their findings, I think, really challenged some of the conventional wisdom. And one of the things that they find is that there's actually a pretty sizable amount of support among justice-involved individuals, specifically individuals who are in prison, for President Trump. And this is especially true among the white males who are currently experiencing incarceration. The second thing that they find is that even among voters in prisons or potential voters in prisons who do align with either the Republican or the Democratic Party, their beliefs on certain key issues actually deviate pretty strongly from the party lines. So individuals who are in prison who identify as Republican actually are more in favorable than maybe the typical GOP stance on the issue of legalizing marijuana. And on the flip side, individuals who identify with the Democratic Party, they really break away from the party line stance on gun reform and gun control. And the last thing that I think was really interesting from their findings is the way that views about the criminal justice system and the future of the criminal justice system vary by racial groups. And so what we have are white voters, white potential voters experiencing prison incarceration identify reducing the total prison population as the key issue for anyone trying to address the criminal justice system. whereas non-white voters overwhelmingly identify the #1 issue with the criminal justice system being a need to eliminate racial biases. So when we think about the ways that voters experiencing incarceration might vote in their own self-interest, I think it's really important to consider that the self-interests aren't as homogenous as maybe we want to typically assume, or maybe we're told in kind of the negative arguments against reenfranchisement. So with all of these limitations off my chest, I want to show you some of the data that we have looked at for the state of North Carolina. And so on this slide, what I have is a list of all of the 2016 state level elections that would have appeared on the ballot in North Carolina. So the winner is in bold and then also given the traditional party color. And then in the far right-hand corner, we have the margin of victory. And so when we compare the margin of victory to the size of the justice-involved population in North Carolina, we see that 6 statewide elections were actually won by a margin that's smaller than the size of this population. In other words, if we were to have reenfranchised the justice-involved population in North Carolina, theoretically about at least six races are in play, or no more than 6 races are in play, I should say. And so we know that in 2016, at the end of the year, there were more than 130,000 people under some form of state supervision. About 37,000 individuals were in state prisons, and about 97,000 individuals were on probation or parole or some other form of post-release supervision that largely would have meant they were ineligible to vote. So while I'm an optimist, I don't want anyone to think that I would imagine 100% voter turnout. So on this next slide, we basically have 2 what we feel are more conservative estimates and maybe would reflect actual voter participation if we saw reenfranchisement in North Carolina. So the first box in green, that 85,000, that would be if we assumed that the justice-involved population voted proportionately to the 2016 statewide turnout of 64%. And then that estimate in yellow, about 69,000 people, that we consider a more conservative estimate of voter participation, and that reflects the fact that 52% of eligible voters came out to vote in the 2018 primary in North Carolina. But I want to emphasize here, even if only a quarter of the justice-involved population were reenfranchised and turned out to vote, we still have the top 5 elections are still in play, and the auditor's race and the governor's race really were won by very, very, very small margins. So the next thing that I want to shift to is a conversation about representation. And so what we have here is a map of North Carolina, and we show the total number of votes that were lost in each county in 2016 because of disenfranchisement. So the number of lost votes is equal to the number of individuals from that county who were incarcerated. This does not mean that they were incarcerated in the county. It just means that prior to their incarceration, this is where they resided, as well as the number of individuals from that county who were on community supervision. And if you know anything about North Carolina, perhaps these results are pretty unsurprising to you, especially when we look at the areas that lost, upwards of 3,000, 4,000 voters in the last election. And a common question on this is, why aren't we showing rates or percentage of the population? We wanted to keep it as number of lost votes in the spirit of one person, one vote. But even if we account for the size of the county and consider that, sure, you're going to lose more voters in a larger county, that's just how things work, we do also want to show you that disenfranchisement does have the potential to swing elections, or I should say alternatively, reenfranchisement could result in changed election results. And so what we have here is another heat map, but this time we're looking at the percentage of elections that were won or lost by a margin of votes that was smaller than 52% of the disenfranchised population that lived in that county prior to incarceration or were currently living there under community supervision. And this, I think, brings up an important point that if we were to move towards reenfranchisement, we have a really important decision to make, which is we need to decide if voters will vote where they are incarcerated or if voters would vote where they lived prior to incarceration. And you can already imagine kind of the lobbying and the political discourse that would happen around this kind of decision making. We chose to show county prior because that's how it works in Vermont and Maine, as well as many of the European countries that already allow for voting for individuals while they're incarcerated for a felony conviction. So this last map that I have here is probably my favorite thing that we've put together because it's a census year. And so it's really important to talk, I think, about representation. And so what we have here is basically the number of lost or gained individuals counted in the population in 2016 due to the fact that people are more often than not incarcerated away from where they typically reside. And so what we can see here is there are a couple of counties that lose more than 1,000 people. Actually, several counties lose more than 1,000 people in the population count because when individuals are incarcerated, they're sent somewhere else. And this has to do with the fact that there are several counties that don't have any prisons. And then there are several counties that have 1 or 2 or 3 very large prisons. And you also have counties that, on the contrary, are gaining population. So this could be because it's a poorly populated or low population county, regardless of how the county is impacted by incarceration. Could also just be that that county is very good at having prisons built there. And one thing that's important to note is that on the previous slide, I kind of showed the counties that are being hit the hardest, with the exception of Wake County, because of the presence of a very large central prison for both men and women. The counties in North Carolina that are hit the hardest by incarceration are unilaterally the counties that are losing voters because they aren't the counties where prisons are being built. And when we think, sure, this has electoral implications, but it's a census year, so I just want to emphasize that for the purpose of counting people and then resource allocation, when it comes time for the census, individuals are given, a county basically claims you as their own if you are incarcerated there. And so even if we aren't re-enfranchising voters, we can still think about the way that incarceration practices are influencing the size of the voice that a community might have or similarly might not have. And so this last slide just kind of talks about some future work on this topic that I really hope to see happen, both because I would like to see re-enfranchise implemented in various forms in more ways. And I certainly think we're seeing that right now. We know Florida has Proposition 4. California is about to vote for re-enfranchisement of voters who are on probation. And so I hope that we get to do more research on the effect of incarceration and re-enfranchisement on community voter turnout. I would like to see a lot of natural experiments possible in this frame. And then similarly, I'm very curious in best practices for facilitating re-enfranchisement and re-engagement of previously disenfranchised voters. So what can we learn from states who've recently taken these initiatives both to restore the rights of justice-involved individuals, but also re-engage politically from a population that has every right to feel that engagement is not in their best interest or not something that they should care about. So thank you all for going through this thought exercise with me. My collaborator Allison and I are hoping to push out a blog post pretty soon that has these maps and just a few more. So be on the lookout for that. And I look forward to discussing this work with y'all.
Thank you so much, Ruth. Thank you so much, Adam. Oh my gosh, can I just say, your research blows me away, and I learned so much, as I know our audience members did during those brief presentations. So thank you so much for sharing. And if it's okay, Adam, I'll ask you to come back on video if you're able, and let's chat a little bit. So, I have a few questions, and I should, I want to monopolize the conversation, but I should make it, open it up to our audience members also. So all of our attendees, if you have questions or comments, please don't hesitate to drop them in the Q&A function, and I'll open it up for your questions as they come in. So please don't be shy, put as many questions as you'd like in, and I will target them to Ruth and Adam. Okay, so first question is just a general one. How did you arrive at this research area? You know, how did you come to do this kind of work? Did you always know you wanted to do this kind of, you know, I'm going to do my dissertation on that, I'm going to do research on that, or did it come about in a more circuitous way? See, Adam, maybe we'll start with you.
Sure. So I grew up in one of the contexts like I was describing. So my research is a little bit of me search, which I know has differing opinions on that, but definitely experienced or saw my friends experience and stuff, the kind of norms that I talked about and the expectations that I talked about, especially related to aggression and I think violence in some contexts. And then I went on to work for the Department of Education in New York City after I graduated from college and did a lot of research with them where we kept finding that boys, and specifically boys of color, were disproportionately at risk for not doing well in school, whether that was violence in school or failing out of school. And nobody really wanted to dig into that question with me and the DOE. And so I reached out to some faculty members across the country who would want to do that and found Dr. Gaither and Anna Gassman-Fines, and they've been great in supporting that kind of trying to figure that socialization piece out.
Very nice. Thank you so much, Adam.
Yeah.
How about you, Ruth?
Yeah, so I really kind of stumbled upon justice involvement and incarceration by happenstance when I was an undergrad. So I did not grow up in a community that's heavily impacted by incarceration. I don't have intimate or family member experience with incarceration. And when I went to college, I wanted to be a health economist. And I was started in Obama's first term, and I was like, I want to design the Affordable Care Act. I was like, this is amazing. And I stumbled upon an article about how healthcare is financed in the prisons. And it's basically an insurance company's dream, but a nightmare for anyone who's actually experiencing incarceration and needs to receive adequate healthcare. And I was just hooked and couldn't stop just like reading articles and discovering the system. And I got to the point where I was like, I'm going to go to grad school, I'm going to do research on this, and I'm very glad that I stumbled upon that article. And specifically with democracy, so when I moved to Durham, one of the first things I did was get involved with You Can Vote to do voter registration in the jails. And that was really my first exposure to the way that justice-involved individuals are or are not thinking about civic participation and engagement. And full disclosure, my collaborator, Allison, was the one who came to me and was like, would you be interested in maybe looking at some data with me, seeing what we can do, especially on the idea of turnout and maybe spillover effects of disenfranchisement or reenfranchisement. So we really got to kind of combine interests, and yeah.
So may I ask a quick follow-up on this? I'm also intrigued by where you sit in terms of your discipline. So as you were trying to figure out, you know, I want to do research on these topics, which discipline would be the best home and provide the best tools for my capacity to do that? I know, Adam, you sit in both public policy and psychology. That's right. And then Ruth, you're in sociology. So I'd love to hear a little bit about your journey to your disciplinary home.
Yeah, I can I sit both in psych and public policy, and I wanted to continue the policy research angle and implementation part of it after I left the Department of Education, because I do like the idea that research shouldn't just live in the academy, and that our findings should be applied in a rigorous, after they've been rigorously conducted, should be applied. And so that was kind of the need or the want to do the policy side and to get some more footing in economics and political science and those kinds of subdisciplines. And then on the psychology side, I kind of had both feet in social and developmental psychology. So my advisor is she's a great new psychologist that spans both areas that have kind of previously been disparate from each other. And so we're trying to figure out and understand these social mechanisms in the adult years, like we'll say fragile masculinity and adulthood, but using research from development. So how can we prevent these things in childhood and then potentially have them affect, you know, more policy related outcomes? So 3 different areas, but trying to grapple each one for hopefully a good outcome, I think.
That's fantastic. I love that. How about you, Ruth?
Yeah, so full disclosure, I'm in a sociology PhD program. I had never taken a sociology class before I started that program. So I knew that methodologically I wanted to be trained as a demographer. So I'm really interested in just like big population data and population movements. And typically demography programs are situated in the sociology context. But I will say, to sociology's credit, I think it definitely takes a social control lens through which to look at the criminal justice system, which I think aligns pretty well just with personally how I view the criminal justice system, as opposed to maybe there are certain disciplines that I think take a public safety approach to things. So I am very appreciative, and I have found kind of like a theoretical home within sociology. But no, like I said, I thought I was going to be an economist, and when my mentors were like, you probably can't do what you want to do in econ, I was kind of stranded. I'm very happy to have been picked up by sociology.
Thank you so much. And I'm over here cringing because we should have had you both in political science, but maybe it's not too late. So I want to ask a little bit about the methods and the data that you typically use. And so Adam, I know you mentioned experiments as sort of the next frontier. And Ruth, you talked about your future projects also. I'd love to hear a little bit about the methods that you tend to use, like Ruth mentioned being a demographer. Love to hear about the methods you use, the data that you often draw upon, and then, I guess an attached question, do you ever have any challenges in terms of finding the perfect data?
Yeah, I'm kind of a nerd when it comes to the history of psychology and social psychology specifically. And I like thinking about how the roots of the field and discipline were in these like really cool in-lab behavioral experiments where they were doing weird things to people and trying to get them to behave in different ways. And so working with Dr. Gaither has been a great learning experience for how to be like a true experimental social psychologist. And then the same thing goes for research with kids, because I think that even before COVID, things were moving more and more online because data collection is just so easy. But I think there's something special and cool and insightful about conducting like real life behavioral experiments. And that being, for me, fundamentally, one of the only ways that you can establish causation or causality is through this kind of experimental paradigm. And so it's more work than would be to collect some of the data in the other ways, but hopefully post-COVID we'll be able to move back into the lab and look at some of the testing these causal theories. And then in terms of sometimes problems that we run into, whenever we work with a lot of like hard to reach populations, so maybe low income communities, when we're testing different kinds of intersections with masculinity or gender. And so that can always be a challenge. And especially with the push in psychology for pre-registration and open science, that's a great push, but it's also more difficult when you're working with harder to reach populations. And so that's always been a challenge for our lab. And then I think a lot of my other favorite part of my work / challenging work is scale development. So a lot of the scales for things that I study, like fragile masculinity, haven't been developed. And so there's a lot of like proxies that touch them. And so I've had to learn from some great psychologists in our department and people in the public policy department, things about scale development I didn't know before, but I've really grown to enjoy that part of it. Like the conceptual being like, how do you measure this construct that exists in your mind, but not in reality? So that's been fun. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I love that, like the capacity to create while you're doing this very sort of rigorous science. I like that.
Yes, for sure.
How about you, Ruth?
So yeah, being a demographer, I think the bigger the data, the better. So I use a lot of, I do a lot of secondary data analysis on very large administrative data sets. So data that's collected by state departments of corrections, data that's collected by the Bureau of Justice Statistics, and then more difficultly, data that's collected by local jails. And I would also say I use a lot of the typical methods that we use in demography. So despite the fact that typically demographers look at things like births and deaths and migration, we see pretty translatable processes in the criminal justice system. So I use a lot of like time to event analysis, survival analysis, I make life tables. So I think methodologically it's really fun to take methods that were basically developed to like how quickly will you die and translate them into the criminal justice space. There are a lot of different outcomes. And I would say we have a lot of challenges working with this data. One, we are totally at the mercy of the gatekeepers of corrections officials as to whether or not this data will be collected, and then further, whether or not this data will be collected well. So I can't tell you the number of data sets that I've downloaded and been so excited about because it has this measure that's like this concept that I really am interested in. And it turns out there's like 75% missing this because it was clearly skipped by any administrator, or it's very clear that because it's typically across facilities, one crime analyst at one prison or at one state department of corrections is clearly interpreting this survey question differently than at another facility, and so we really can't use that data. And then the last thing that I would just point out is I definitely have personal conversations with myself all the time about like the ethics of using this data, and frankly, to answer some of the questions I'm really interested in, it would require more data collection, and I'm very cognizant of the fact that that is personal information from just a population that is deprioritized in our society and more at risk for adverse outcomes inflicted upon them. So it's a constant battle to weigh, wow, I really want to do this cool thing with what do I believe individuals have the right to with regards to, data information, data privacy, especially in a field where consent just like largely isn't possible for the work that we do.
Oh, that's fascinating. I'd also love to hear a little bit about, both of you mentioned that you're interested in really big ideas, and you shared insights that I think are really theoretically rich, and you're asking big questions, and these are very bold contributions to your respective literatures. And I just wonder, to what extent do you find room or that there's space for this kind of big thinking in your home disciplines? Do you ever feel like, like if we're thinking of conferences or journals, or, is the work that you do, to your mind, will it be well received? Are you sort of going against the grain? I'd love to hear a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's a good question. We'll see if my theory paper makes it into a journal next spring. But I think psychology and either social and developmental, I try to draw on a lot of pre-existing theories and suggest that I'm modifying them in senses rather than and like the theory that I'm proposing and putting forth is one that's kind of like a culmination of like 4 different theories. And so I feel like a lot of researchers before me have paved the way for this kind of research. It's not necessarily new in the field. It's new when I talk about it maybe to people who aren't in psychology, but I'm able to fortunately be able to draw on the work of like pioneers who put forth these ideas before I was around. So I think that people now more than ever are open to the idea that maybe like masculinity is not something that is inherent, and maybe we should challenge the way that we think about it. I feel very fortunate to be doing that now rather than 20 years ago when some of this research was started, because I imagine that got a lot of pushback. But even now, especially when I talk to people who are not in academia or outside of my field specifically, there is this inherent, it's like this meta threat response that I get from especially men that are like, oh, well, it's not that bad. It's just how things are. And it's like, no, this is what I'm studying. You're doing what I'm studying. And so it's a funny thing for me to have to step back and be like, okay, it's not, then I get threatened that they're threat. So it's like this whole thing, but I feel like I'm in a good place right now where we are, as a field, moving in the direction to be like inclusive of these ideas that maybe gender's not always the greatest thing.
Adam, I feel like your last comment, I was just seeing the Spider-Man meme, like, you know what I'm talking about with Spider-Man?
Yeah.
All of that.
Yeah.
How about you, Ruth?
So I'm constantly wondering whether or not it's my ideas or like my standing as just a third-year grad student that pushed me to like hedge everything with like 3 million caveats. And I constantly feel like, I know this is a big idea and I know what you're going to say. And I read that paper too, and I know why this is infeasible. So I look forward to the day when I feel like I can communicate my ideas without being like so aware of the immediate pushbacks that they're going to get, both because of confidence in myself and then just movement of the dialogue in a direction that more favors my view of the world I want to live in. And then I will say within sociology, and I think within the academy in general, I've been able to find my people, and I've been able to find professors that have a similar investment in seeing big ideas into the public discourse and into practice. There are several professors who are very actively engaged in, public sociology and who are fighting the good fight to reenfranchise voters in North Carolina or in all across the country. I just came from a presentation by Professor Chris Eugen, who's really the pioneer in this. And I think similarly, you're able to find other professors and other grad students who are really supportive of these big ideas and understanding that, like, if you can do good science and if you can do good science well, it is perfectly acceptable to have visions for the future. And so it is possible to do both positive and normative science very, very well.
Thank you for that. You know, and Ruth, may I stick with you for just a moment, and then I'll ask Adam the same question. I'm curious about this point that you made about like public sociologists. I think a lot, especially about the capacity of social science to provide insights to the broader society. And I think historically we've had a tradition where, like, I do a lot of work on inequality. There were certain, generations of scholars who really did shape how we think about things like, masculinity, or, what it means to be African American, what it means to be a woman, and so forth. And so I do think there's there's an important role that social scientists, that researchers can play in the broader society. And but there's also kind of a tension, because that's not necessarily, something that, one, scholars are trained to do, to be public intellectuals, or two, there are many disincentives to engage in that way. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on, to your mind, some options for scholars when it comes to engaging in the public or in public life.
Yeah, absolutely. No denying it is bleak. No denying I hear don't do public sociology 100 times more often than I hear, yes, do public sociology. Or my favorite is like, just wait until after you're tenured. Like, wait until you're a full professor and like you have no risk, and then go and make the world a better place. So yeah, that tension is very real. I guess the thing that I would say is I'm most impressed by academics who have found a way to give their time and their talents to something outside of their work that still has, without it being entirely polarizing. So academics who proportion some amount of their time to helping with reports for nonprofits. So collaborations with organizations like the Vera Institute and being a faculty advisor, or the Sentencing Project, helping those organizations write grants. Having letters next to your name just brings you an authority and a perceived expertise that can be really, really useful and really, really powerful and beneficial. So I think, using your knowledge for good, if you will. In my work, I'm constantly inspired by individuals who take their teaching talents into correctional facilities. And, that's something I definitely want to do someday. So I think there are ways to do it, and it just comes down to, again, finding those really benevolent souls and aligning with them, and not listening to the people who tell you it's, career suicide, or it jeopardizes things, or it belittles you. Kind of pushing those voices out and finding the examples to follow in the footsteps of.
That's great. Thank you so much, Ruth. Adam, how about you?
Can I just say same answer? That's great. I think in psychology, I've heard it more called applied psychology, public psychology, but same kind of sentiment that even when I was applying for graduate school, I was told not to apply or attend applied psychology programs because they don't have the same reputation that basic psychology programs do. So I think there's this huge misconception in the field that that can't be good work, or that can't be rigorous psychology, and I just disagree with that. And I do feel like, for me personally, I fortunately fall very much into psychology and have, like Bruce said, have that theoretical home there. But for other people who do it the other way, go from like applied work into theory, I think that's informing theory is just as important. I just happen to like the theory building. But I do think there's this public misconception, or this perception that psychology should be basic and should not be applied. And I just think that's kind of sad, because a lot of the interesting things that I've learned about psychology have been from a subfield called community psychology that's not really around anymore because it doesn't have the attention that it used to have. And that was all based in like trying to use clinical psychology to reach the community level, so preventing like mental health disorders at the community level. And I thought that was fascinating. And just I am hopeful that the field itself is moving back toward that. And I hope that doing the PhD in both psychology and public policy, I'll be able to kind of bridge those two in my future work. And yeah, I think doing work in schools with kids, doing work with families, hopefully writing a book about that would be great one day, how to raise boys or something along those lines. And also I think working in positions in the university, like my advisor does a ton of work with Duke on issues of race and discrimination. And so I look to her as kind of like a great model, like Ruth was mentioning, different people she's thinking of. My advisor is just as great about giving a lot of her time to the university in terms of resolving maybe some issues of race and racial tension. So yeah, stuff like that.
That's wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah.
And I want to just mention to our audience that if you have questions, please do feel free to throw them in the Q&A box. As we near the end of our time together, I want to make sure I don't monopolize the Q&A. But of course, I have like a million questions. So I'm also curious, you know, the kind of work that you do. I think one of you said it at the top of the hour about how sometimes the findings are a bit grim. And I think that, you know, when you do heavy research on topics that involve people's lives, you know, and in certain cases, you're doing sort of me search, you know, I'm in that same box. Sometimes it can be heavy, and sometimes knowledge can be a burden. And, you know, it's one thing to sort of live in a messy political context as a citizen or as a resident of a polity, but also to be a researcher who actually knows sort of what's behind a lot of the messy things that we're seeing. That can be somewhat stressing. How do you all deal with that? Like, you know, maybe this is a two-part question. Is one, you know, does that kind of reflect your experience? And two, if so, how do you take care of yourself when you do this kind of work?
Ruth, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, the messiness is there. I think it's very funny. I didn't know what the term academic guilt meant, and I realized I had given it a totally different meaning than it was. So my academic guilt was I'm sitting here studying these things and not doing enough to alleviate them. And then I realized, no, it's like you're not working enough. And I was like, oh, I don't relate. Maybe I'm going to be a really bad academic someday for just that reason. So no, I think the guilt is really real. And my way of alleviating that is just reminding myself that the work that I do is really labor, and the hours that I put to that are the hours that I put to that. And just staying involved in the community and doing other things otherwise. And in some ways, yes, they're on similar topics. Like I said, I do research on voting in the justice system, and I also actively do registration for voters. And I think separating those two things and just giving myself the credit of, okay, I am doing some things, even when I feel like with the academic hat on, maybe I'm not doing enough. And then I'm constantly asking people who've stayed in the field and stayed in this topic area, what sustains them and what has allowed, you know, a professor who's still doing this incredible work 25 years later, what's keeping them. So I look to their optimism. I select on the dependent variable and only ask people who've survived this, you know, fight that can be academia. Like, how did you make it here and still, you know, sleep well at night? So again, follow the amazing people before me.
I love that so much. Yeah, Adam, how about you?
No, that's great. I definitely think so. And in terms of, I think, like you were saying, it can be kind of a barrage of not only the news that we're receiving and things that are coming at us constantly, like a citizen or non-academic person would, but not that we're not citizens, but that in addition to that, we kind of have to dive deeper and explore what's going on. And so for me, I think the hardest parts are exploring this and seeing empirically how it's problematic, like it's harming boys' self-esteem and men's self-esteem and contributing to these adverse developmental experiences and then causing aggression in certain contexts. Like, but then to go out and see tweets like Tomi Lahren's and be like, this is the problem. Like, why can't you just not tweet that? Like, that's just so easy not to tweet that. And that's the frustrating thing, because I'm like, should I tweet back at her? That's not going to do anything. Like, what do I do in that context? And so I guess with regard to my research, to just make myself feel better, I really try to have intentional, meaningful conversations with people that are from my hometown or from my home area or from more conservative areas that I feel like I can change their minds. Like, I've known them my whole life. They trust me. They don't trust a Democratic, progressive, far left pundit or whatever it is on CNN, but I might be able to get through them and just say, like, maybe when your friend's kid is trying to express that they might be trans, here's how you could support them. And I just came from a haircut this morning where that was the conversation. The haircut person was his kid is coming out as trans, and so it was a whole conversation about how to be as supportive. From my perspective, with very limited experience with trans youth, just knowing what I know about gender norms. So I was a little bit tiring to do that for almost an hour and a half. The haircut went way longer than it should have, but at the same time, it put a little bit of like road to the rubber in terms of just the theoretical kind of academic work that I do. So I try to do that. And I'd like to do that formally in some capacity in the future, like write about how to have these conversations for people who want to have better conversations about that. That's something I'd like to do down the road.
Well, goodness knows our society needs as much, as many insights as we can get. Thank you so much. I have to say, this has been a pleasure. I could talk to you all afternoon about your wonderful work and your valuable insights. So we are very grateful for Adam Staniland, PhD candidate in psychology and public policy here at Duke University, and Ruth Weigel, PhD candidate in sociology, also here at Duke University. And many thanks to our audience for being with us. We hope that you will join us right here at 6 o'clock for the final event of our 2-day conference, our keynote address with Professor Guy Charles from Duke University's Law School. And a final thanks to Adam and Ruth. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone.
See you soon.